$10 isn't supposed to change a life. That's what everyone in town always said when they slipped coins into lottery machines and pulled them back out again, empty. But as the bus rattled away behind him and the mountain road narrowed into grit and frozen mud beneath his boots, Eli kept one hand shoved deep in his pocket, fingers curled tight around the thin, crinkled receipt that said in faded ink he now owned a deserted cabin for exactly $10 and a signature that hardly looked like his name. The air up here tasted different than it did down in the valley. It was thinner, sharper, cleaner, and it carried every sound like a secret it hadn't decided whether to keep. His breath came out in small white ghosts ahead of him. His other hand held the strap of his backpack, so the weight of his whole life, 2 shirts, a dented pot, an old photograph folded in half, a little tin of coins and notes worth less than the paper they were printed on, didn't drag him sideways. Rust trotted just ahead, paws crunching in the thin layer of old snow that clung to the shaded side of the road, tail swinging in that hopeful, crooked rhythm he'd never quite lost even after the city alleys and shelter nights. Every so often the dog looked back over his shoulder as if to check that Eli was still there, brown eyes asking the same silent question he'd asked the day Eli found him hiding under a dumpster. "Are we really doing this?" Eli answered the way he always did, by keeping his feet moving. The idea of the cabin had started as a joke in his own head, a passing thought the day he saw the notice taped to the municipal office window, the paper beginning to curl at the corners from being ignored. Tax seizure, Forest Service property, abandoned ranger cabin, no road access in winter, starting bid, $10. People had laughed when they saw it. "Who'd want that old wreck?" they'd said at the diner, "when you could freeze to death in something a little closer to town instead?" "The mountain eats houses," old men muttered over their coffee, especially ones built by folks who think they can outrun their ghosts. But Eli had stood in front of the glass a long time, hands in his worn jacket, listening to the faint hum of the town behind him. Cars, radios, arguments spilling out of doorways, and the mountain's silent outline just beyond, dark and indifferent. $10. It was almost an insult. It was also exactly the amount folded into the little envelope the social worker had pressed into his hand the day she said, "You're 16 now, Eli. We can't keep placing you. You're allowed to make your own decisions." As if being allowed made it easier. As if decisions were something he hadn't been making alone for years. He'd walked out of that office with Rust at his heel, the dog's old shelter tag still clinking against his collar, and the town had looked smaller than it ever had. No one offered him a ride. No one asked where he'd go. The only thing that had spoken to him was that scrap of paper in the window, fluttering as the door opened and closed. A joke to everyone else, a door to him. So he'd gone to the auction, sitting in the back of the hall with his hat pulled low, trying to make his shoulders look broader than they were. No one bid against him. The clerk looked almost embarrassed when he banged the gavel, as if he were complicit in some kind of cruelty or charity he couldn't name. "You'll need a stove inspection if you want to use the chimney," the man said, sliding the key and the receipt across the desk after. "Cabin's been boarded 6 years. Weather up there turns fast. Wouldn't recommend." His voice had faded when he realized Eli wasn't listening. The boy had been staring at the key, turning it over in his hand. It was newer than he expected, the metal still bright, the teeth sharp. Someone had replaced the lock not too long ago. That detail planted a small stone of unease in his stomach, but he swallowed it, along with his pride, and tucked the key away. Now, 2 days later, the road had long since narrowed to a trail, and the town was nothing but a suggestion behind him. Tall pines crowded close on both sides, their trunks black with age and damp, branches murmuring with every touch of wind. Patches of sky showed through in dull strips, a flat gray blue that matched the film of cold in his chest. Eli shifted the pack higher on his shoulders, feeling the weight grind into his collarbones. "You still with me, Rust?" he called, voice carrying oddly in the cold. The dog turned and trotted backward a couple of steps, tongue lolling, then spun and bounded ahead again. His paws left clear marks in the snow, overlapping Eli's boot prints. Eli followed those prints around a bend and almost walked straight into the view that told him he'd reached it. The trees fell back to reveal a small clearing cupped in the slope like a shallow palm. At its center, leaning into the hill as if the mountain were holding it up out of pity, stood the cabin. It was smaller than he'd imagined and bigger at the same time. The roof sagged in the middle under the weight of old snow pushed tight into the shingles by years of wind. One corner of the porch had collapsed, dropping the end of the railing down into a slump of gray wood. The windows were boarded, planks nailed across them in crooked X shapes that made the place look blind and guarded. Moss grew in long green lines between the logs, and an old metal chimney pipe rose from the roof like a finger pointing at the low clouds. The whole structure looked like it had been left to think about its sins. Eli stopped at the edge of the clearing, heart beating a little faster. He had slept in worse places, under bridges and on church steps, in cars that didn't belong to him, and trailer park sheds that smelled of gasoline and mold. Those places had never felt like anything but borrowed discomfort. This, though, this sorry-looking box of wood and rusted nails, this had his name on a piece of paper. Thin as that paper was, that meant something. "Not much," he murmured, "but something." Rust trotted ahead, sniffing around the broken railing, tail swinging cautiously. Eli caught the dog's collar before he could bound onto the porch. "Hang on," he said. "Let me go first. If this thing collapses, it'll be my fault, not yours." The porch groaned under his weight, but held, boards creaking like old men's joints. Up close, he could see where someone had hammered the boards across the door and windows. The nails were newer than the wood, silver bright where the rain hadn't touched them. That same little stone of unease shifted in his stomach again. The Forest Service hadn't nailed this shut. They would have used their own bright notices and official stencils. This was the work of somebody else, someone who'd wanted people to stay out for reasons that weren't printed on government forms. Still, whatever those reasons had been, they were part of the past. The receipt in his pocket said so. He set his hand on the door, feeling the cold seep through the boards. "Guess it's just us now," he said to it, half under his breath. Rust whined softly, nails clicking on the porch as he shifted his weight from paw to paw, scanning the tree line. Eli pulled off his glove with his teeth and dug the key out of his pocket, fingers stiff from the cold. The padlock on the door was old but not ancient, its metal dulled rather than eaten. He slipped the key into the slot, jaw tightening against the little tremor that ran up his arm as the teeth caught. For a second he thought it wouldn't turn. Then, with a soft clunk that echoed louder in his head than in the clearing, the lock gave. He slid it free, the weight of it landing in his palm like a punctuation mark at the end of a sentence that hadn't been written yet. He set it aside, then pried at the lowest of the crossboards. The nails protested with a long, complaining screech but came loose. One by one he pulled them away, stacking the planks against the wall. With each board gone, More of the cabin's darkness showed through the gaps around the door, like a held breath leaking out. When the last board fell aside, he hesitated, hand on the worn doorknob. He wasn't superstitious. The world hadn't left him much room for magic. But he believed in small turning points, in the weight of moments where you either walk in or turn away and spend the rest of your life pretending it was a choice. He drew in a breath that tasted like pine and old snow. "All right," he whispered, mostly to himself. "Let's see what $10 buys on this mountain." He turned the handle and pushed. The door opened with a sigh, as if the cabin were disappointed to be disturbed. Cold, musty air washed over him, tinged with old smoke and something else beneath it, something wild and sharp that made the tiny hairs on his arms stand up. Rust tried to push around his leg, but Eli blocked him with a knee. "Wait," he murmured. "Let me check it." He stepped inside. The dim swallowed him immediately. Only narrow slivers of light cut through the cracks in the boarded windows. Dust hung in the air in lazy spirals. The room was one open space with a stone hearth, a table that had lost one of its legs, 2 chairs that had given up the fight, and a counter with a rusted sink sunk into it. An iron hook by the door held a long abandoned coat, stiff with time. The floor creaked under his boots, but didn't sag. Eli took another step, ear tuned to every new sound. Somewhere deeper in the cabin, something shifted. Just a faint scrape, like fabric dragging over wood. He froze, breath catching. Rust, still on the porch, let out a low growl that buzzed against Eli's spine. "Hello?" Eli called, hating the way his voice wobbled. No answer. He swallowed, forcing himself to move toward the sound. The main room narrowed into a short hallway at the back, 2 doors facing each other like strangers who'd run out of things to say. One stood half open, showing the edges of a small room with bare walls, a metal bed frame, and a smashed lamp on the floor. Eli glanced inside, noted the empty corners, then turned to the other door. This one was closed. A line of colder air slipped through the gap at the bottom, curling around his ankles. That strange smell was stronger here, cutting through the dust, a scent like stone after rain, fur, and the metallic tang of something that wasn't quite blood, but was close enough to wake old panic. Eli set his hand on the knob. It was icy, as if someone had pressed a block of snow to it and held it there. Rust barked once from the front room, sharp and alarmed. Everything in Eli's body screamed at him to back away, to nail the boards back up, to pretend he hadn't heard anything at all. Instead, he did what he'd always done in rooms where he was afraid. He kept moving forward because there was nothing behind him worth running back to. He turned the knob and pushed the door open. At first, all he saw was darkness and the outline of a small square space. Bare walls, a window boarded so tightly no light slipped through, the shape of an old trunk in one corner. The smell hit him full then, cold and wild, flooding over him like water. His eyes adjusted slowly. Something shifted in the far corner, a soft thump and rustle. He squinted, breath shallow. 2 pale points appeared in the dark, reflecting the faint light from the hallway like chips of ice. Eyes. Too high off the ground to be a raccoon, too steady to be a frightened house pet. The shape around them separated from the shadows. A head, long and narrow, ears pricked and edged in white, fur thick and pale with gray along the back. The animal unfolded itself from the floor in one smooth, slow motion, muscles rippling under winter coat, paws placing themselves with silent precision on the worn boards. It was larger than any dog he'd ever seen, but lean, every line of its body built for running, for climbing, for surviving. A tail, heavy with fur, brushed the ground once. The scars came into view next, thin white lines tracing across its flank, one old bite mark near the shoulder, the faint shadow of something healed but not forgotten. A snow wolf, his mind supplied, dredging up a half-remembered picture from a library book he'd once hidden in the back of a foster home bedroom, tracing the shapes with a finger. The kind of wolf that was supposed to live farther north, high on ridges people didn't climb, not in boarded cabins bought for $10. The wolf stared at him, not snarling, not shrinking, just watching, eyes bright and unblinking, head held at a level that said it did not consider itself beneath him in any way. Eli's throat went dry. His fingers slackened on the doorknob. He heard Rust's claws skittering on the wooden floor somewhere behind him, the dog's growl turning into a thin, choked sound. The wolf's ears flicked toward the noise, then back to Eli. The air in the room felt thick, as if every dust mote had turned to stone. Time thinned to a narrow thread between boy and animal. Eli counted his heartbeats without meaning to. 1, 2, 3. The wolf took a single step forward, paw landing noiselessly, its gaze never leaving his. It was close enough now that he could see the individual hairs in its coat, the way the light caught on a few darker ones along its muzzle, the faint lift of its chest with each controlled breath. There was no panic in those eyes, no wild, flailing fear, only calculation. Recognition, almost, like it had been waiting for whoever opened that door. Eli realized then he wasn't afraid in the way he should have been. The terror was there, sure, cold and sharp in his stomach, but braided through it was something else, an odd, stunned understanding that he was standing at the edge of a line that split his life into before and after. He had come looking for a cheap roof and 4 walls to keep the wind out. Instead, he had walked into a room and found the mountain itself staring back at him in the shape of a snow wolf that had already claimed this deserted cabin as its own. His $10 had bought him more than a place to sleep. It had bought him a secret, wild and breathing, and close enough that he could hear it exhale as the wolf tilted its head, studying him with the same quiet, unnerving intensity he had always thought belonged only to people who were deciding what to do with him. Rust whimpered once at his back. Eli swallowed hard, fingers tightening on the doorknob again as if it were the only solid thing in the room. "Okay," he whispered, hardly aware he'd spoken aloud, voice scraping against the cold air. "You're not in the listing." The snow wolf's ears twitched at the sound of his voice. For the first time, something like curiosity flickered in its gaze, softening the hard, bright line of it. Outside, wind moved through the trees, rattling the boards over the window with a low, creaking groan. The world beyond the cabin felt very far away. Inside, in that small, dark room at the end of a forgotten hallway, a mountain boy who had thought he'd finally found a place to hide stood frozen on the threshold of a life he hadn't known was waiting for him, breath trapped in his chest as a snow wolf watched him like a question only he could answer. For a long moment, Eli didn't move, the cold from the floorboards seeping slowly upward through his boots as though the cabin itself were reminding him that he had stepped into something older than the boards and darker than the shadows, and the snow wolf kept its silent vigil in the far corner of the tiny room, breath rising in faint, steady clouds, pale eyes fixed on him with a patience that felt less like calm and more like the stillness before something decides whether you are threat or kin. Behind him, Rust whimpered again, a trembling thread of sound that snapped Eli out of the trance, just enough for him to take a single step back, his heel brushing the hallway floor, and the wolf followed the movement with its gaze, not shifting its weight, not preparing to lunge, simply watching him with the unnerving composure of something that had lived longer than fear itself. Eli forced his voice into the cold space between them. "I didn't know this place was taken," he whispered, the words barely shaping themselves. The wolf's ears twitched, its head tilting a fraction, as though sorting through the sound, evaluating its meaning. It took one silent step toward him, and Eli felt his pulse lurch, but the wolf stopped there, halfway between corner and doorway, close enough that he could see the faint tremor in its flank, the subtle hitch of breath that spoke of exhaustion or pain. That's when Eli saw it, the slight drag of the right hind leg, a stiffness in the joint that made the movement uneven, and the faint dark smear along the fur near its hip, half hidden beneath winter coat. It wasn't fresh, but it wasn't old either. Something had hurt it recently. Something big. Something that had left those strange dragging tracks outside the cabin. The thought slid into Eli's mind like an icicle breaking loose. The wolf wasn't here by accident. It hadn't wandered into the cabin for shelter. It had come here because it was running from something. And somehow, the cabin, his cabin now, was the only place it believed it could survive whatever had chased it. Eli stepped back one more pace, slow and controlled, feeling the weight of the doorknob under his fingers like the only anchor he had. "I'm not here to hurt you," he murmured. The wolf blinked slowly, a deliberate, heavy motion, as though acknowledging him in a language older than words. Rust shifted behind him, claws scraping faintly as he pushed his head around Eli's thigh, eyes wide and still. Eli lowered his hand toward the dog, fingers brushing fur, grounding himself. Then he did something he didn't understand until he was already doing it. He crouched down. Not all the way, not low enough to make himself vulnerable, but just enough to signal what every animal understood instinctively. "I'm not here to challenge you." The wolf's eyes softened, only barely, the tension in its stance changing from braced to wary. It let out a breath, long and slow, like a tired sigh carried from the farthest edge of winter. Eli swallowed. "You're hurt," he said quietly. "That's why you're here." The wolf shifted its injured leg slightly, not as a show of weakness, but as if to confirm the truth. Eli felt the weight of the moment settle into his ribs. He could shut the door. He could back away. He could pretend he had never walked into this room, never opened the cabin, never bought a place the mountain had clearly tried to warn him about. But something had changed inside him the moment he saw those pale eyes in the dark, something that pushed back against every instinct that told him to run. He didn't know if it was courage or foolishness. Maybe they were the same thing. "Let me help," he whispered. The wolf's ears flicked. Then it did something he hadn't expected. It sat. Not fully, not relaxed, but enough to show it was listening. Eli's heart hammered against his ribs, knocking loose the last of his hesitation. Slowly, keeping his movements steady, he reached into his pack and pulled out the small tin of salve he'd carried for Rust's scrapes and cuts. He held it loosely, palm open, letting the scent drift into the air. The wolf's nostrils flared, its posture tightened, then loosened, something like recognition in its gaze, not of the salve, but of the intention. Eli shuffled one knee forward, inch by inch. The wolf didn't retreat. It didn't growl. It simply watched him with that unblinking patience, the kind that said it was giving him exactly one chance to prove himself worthy of the distance between them. Rust leaned forward, ears high, but stayed behind Eli, as if understanding this wasn't his moment to lead. When Eli was within arm's reach, he stopped, breath shallow. "I'm going to touch your leg," he whispered. "Just your leg." The wolf lowered its head slightly, not submission, not acceptance, but permission. Eli extended his hand. His fingers brushed fur, cold and coarse, heavy with winter. The wolf tensed, muscles rippling under his touch, but it didn't pull away. Eli found the wound, hidden beneath thick hair, a deep gash that had been cleaned only by snow and time. Whatever had clawed it had claws bigger than any wolf, bigger than any bear he'd seen in books. His breath caught. The wolf flicked an ear as if sensing the question forming behind his eyes. "Not now," that gesture seemed to say. "Later." Eli dabbed the salve onto the wound with gentle fingers. The wolf shivered once, a tight ripple through its frame, then exhaled, a warm gust brushing Eli's wrist. A thank you, or a warning, or both. When he finished, Eli closed the tin quietly and slid it back into his pack. He sat there another breath, then another, before slowly standing. The wolf rose too, balancing carefully on its injured leg. For a heartbeat, they stood close, boy and wolf, breath mingling in the cold room, two creatures equally unsure of what the other meant to their survival. Then, the wolf stepped back, melting into the shadows, the way mist rewinds into a river. Eli backed out of the room, keeping his gaze low but steady. When he reached the hallway, he eased the door almost shut, leaving it cracked, an invitation, not a trap. Rust pressed against him as if confirming that the world was still real. Eli knelt and buried his fingers in the dog's fur. "He's not going to hurt us," he whispered. "Not unless we give him a reason." Rust huffed, uncertain. Eli stood and returned to the main room, the fire still flickering low in the hearth. Snow began tapping lightly against the roof, each soft patter a reminder that storms didn't wait for courage. He fed the fire, warmth slowly wrapping around the cabin walls like a thin blanket. And then he felt it, that subtle shift in the air, the quiet change in presence. He turned. The snow wolf stood in the doorway of the hall, not hiding, not threatening, simply observing him. Its eyes held something new. Not trust, not yet, but recognition, as if it had made a decision too. Eli nodded once, slow. "This cabin is big enough for both of us," he said softly, "if you want it." The wolf blinked. Then, with a grace that seemed too large for the small, rough room, it stepped forward into the light of the hearth. Not all the way, just enough that the warm glow touched its fur. A single, silent agreement. Outside, something groaned deep in the woods. A long, dragging sound Eli recognized too quickly. The thing that had hurt the wolf. The thing that had followed its trail to his cabin. The wolf's ears pricked sharply. Rust growled low. The fire cracked. And Eli understood with a cold certainty that he had not bought a simple cabin. He had bought a battleground, or a refuge, or both. He looked at the wolf, the dog, the small fire trying its best to hold the darkness back, and for the first time since he stepped off the bus, he felt something like purpose steadying his breath. "Whatever's out there," he whispered, "you're not facing it alone anymore." The wolf's pale eyes gleamed in the firelight, not soft, not grateful, resolute. Outside, the storm thickened. Inside, 3 lives stood quietly in the glow of a $10 cabin, waiting for what the mountain would demand next.